Derek, if you looked at some of the things that you did like from Nick Nurse the season ago, even having to navigate through all the injuries and maybe some concerns there as well, what are some things that stood out to you that you would like to see continue to translate to this particular group, or even get a little bit better?
Yeah, well, Kyle sort of mentioned it. I did like that they got a little bit more aggressive after Embiid went down, not just because I thought they had to, because their offense was so bad they had to find a way to generate more transition opportunities. And if you go back in the post, I get yelled at every time I bring up. I have to. In the post Ben Simmons era, the Sixers were mid-pack.
Oh, Winona!
Look,
wave your finger
at
Derek.
Only
you
one
said
way
I don't want to hear that name.
I'm getting to a good point. I promise. In the post Ben Simmons era, the Sixers were like mid-pack in terms of forcing turnovers, like 14th and 17th in 2 consecutive years, something like that. They were, I believe, 4th last year. And a lot of that came after Embiid went down. I think they were 1st in the league in terms of forcing turnovers after Embiid went down with that injury.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that because they needed to in order to try to stay competitive, but because I think that translates pretty well this year when you add in Caleb Martin, when you add in Paul George, when maybe Ricky Council gets a little bit more playing time. I think they have some of the athletes, not necessarily that they had in Toronto, but certainly more than they had last year and more than they had 2 years ago. And that's where I'm excited to see what Nick Nurse can do, because I do think you're going to spend a lot of time in a drop. And in order to do that successfully, especially with Drummond, who's just not nearly as good of a rim protector and quite frankly just can't come up to the level of the screen like Joel Embiid can, one way to mitigate that weakness is to have your wings really help onto drivers and be able to recover back. And I think they just have way more tools in their arsenal to be a little bit more, you're not going to have scheme diversity in terms of being able to switch with your 5, but you might be able to show a ball handler a crowd and not get punished for it. But the one big question mark I have is in the backcourt, which is why we've spent so much time focusing on can you get enough, ball handling and shot creation and passing and shooting without having to rely on people shorter than Kyle Neubeck.
I'm so glad you brought that up, as we always somehow do on this show, Derek.
Pass the test, man.
You can't let a good bit die.
So one of the things I'm fascinated in, or I'm keeping an eye on certainly, is the rebounding and the size of this team, as you're alluding to. But beyond that, it's okay, if our thesis that we've talked about a lot, right, which is that they have more wings, they have more athleticism, they can guard the yard, so to speak, and guard their individual guy on a lot more consistent of a basis than last season. And Joel Embiid is back at the rim. He can play more, maybe not more drop, but be near the rim in their coverage for more rebounding opportunities and whatnot. And they still have rebounding problems. The question is, what exactly do you do before making a personnel move, right? Because if they struggle rebounding out of the gate first month and a half, you're still not realistically making a trade for another, at minimum, another month, more than likely another couple months until you're, all right, we feel like this is actually a problem. We've reached about halfway through the season, and rebound, if it's rebounding, if it's playmaking, whatever it is, but we're sticking with rebounding now. How do you manufacture rebounding with either your personnel groupings or how you're set up, right? Like a lot of this team just rests on, Joel, you got to be a better rebounder this season than you were maybe last year, even than what we saw in the Olympics, right? Mm-hmm. Where he's surrounded by plenty of other guys who can help. LeBron's still a good rebounder at his age. Steph Curry maybe less so, but you have a lot of switchable athletic wings on that team. Even like a Drew Holiday is a big guard who can help out there, not even necessarily grabbing them himself, but boxing guys out, keeping the lane clear. And Joel at the end of those games was still having some issues with, whether it was focus, positioning, conditioning, whatever it might be. So Nick Nurse, how does he respond to that challenge? Is it just as simple as Yabusele's got to play more minutes because he's a big body? I don't think he's like a great individual defensive rebounder on his own. I think he's more of he'll crash the offensive glass. I think he can be a weapon there. But, how do you do this where so much of your personnel is backcourt based, right? And frankly, a lot of those backcourt guys, as Derek alluded to earlier, are guys that want and expect to play. Like Reggie Jackson didn't come to play with his friend Paul George and then sit on the bench and wave a towel, right? Kyle Lowry, the relationship we've talked about many times with Nick Nurse. He didn't come back so that he could just, rot at the end of the bench and hang out in his hometown, right? He's expecting to have maybe not a huge role, but a sizable enough role that we're going to notice him night to night. And so if these guys factor into your rotation, I'm not sure exactly how you get there. And add on top of this, if you play zone more often, which we saw a pretty good amount of zone last year, you're always susceptible to offensive rebounds, or more susceptible to offensive rebounds playing out of a zone than playing in a typical man defense. And so we've talked a lot about the personnel-based concerns on the rebounding front. What can Nick Nurse do to help that problem?
We all silly like the mayor.